Good evening, ma'am. Good evening, classmate. My report is all about distribution to shareholders, dividends, and share repurchases. So, the specific topic are dividend policy, dividend theories, residual dividend model, and dividend reinvestment plans. So, what is the dividend policy? In the company, hindi basta-basta magbibigay ng dividends because you have to consider also the impact as to the price and other things. So, the dividend policy is the decision to pay earnings versus retaining and reinvesting them. There it is a balance between paying out dividends and using the net income to reinvest in the business. So, what is the inclusions in a dividend policy? So, we have high or low dividend payout, whether to give a stable or perhaps irregular dividends, how frequent the management should pay dividends, and whether to announce the policy or not. So, dividend irrelevance theory. Kumbaga, ang dividend irrelevance theory ang nag-hold ng belief that dividends don't have any effect sa company stock price. So, in the continuation of Modigliani and Miller, the two expert, which is according to them, the investors are indifferent between dividends and retention generated capital gains. So, sinasabi dito na it doesn't matter whether they will receive dividends or have a capital gains, but these conditions will only happen if yung assumption ni Modigliani and Miller are there or present. However, as we already know, the conditions or the assumptions set by Modigliani and Miller are very unrealistic because one of the assumptions are among investors or the tax paid when they receive dividends and capital gains is walang tax or perhaps walang brokerage cost na babayaran. So, in reality, of course, when you receive dividends, it would be part of your income, and also the capital gains, of course, nakadepende yon sa investment mo or puhunan, and it also depends whether you buy that through stock exchange. So, yung brokerage cost naman, ito yung mga fees when you buy and sell stocks. So, meron talaga yung corresponding fees. So, in short, the dividend relevance theory is not really very applicable in today's environment. So, according to the irrelevance theory, the investors can create their own dividend policy. So, if they want cash, they can sell stock, and if they don't want cash, they can use dividends to buy stock. So, next is the reason why investors might prefer dividends. So many think dividends are less risky than potential future capital gains. So, of course, diba, when the board or already announced na mag-declare or mag-provide ng dividends, the cash becomes a reality. Okay, diba? Yung income mo becomes a reality. So, assured ang dividends compared sa capital gains. So that is why it is viewed by a lot of investors na mas risky. Of course, when in based on time value of money, we know that the money we will receive now is always higher compared to the value of the money to be received in the future. So all these things contribute to the mindset that the dividends are less risky compared to the potential future capital gains. So, investors would have high payout firms more highly, and high payout would result into the high PO. So, if you remember PO, that's the intrinsic value for the stock. So, in this formula, PO is equals to the next dividend or future dividend over growth rate. So based on this formula, if the company will give higher dividends and the growth rate is constant, then we can say that those companies that are giving higher dividends would result into higher value of stock. So let's say for example, last year they gave 5 pesos per share, and then the growth rate, let's say 0.05%, and so let's say we compare this to with the company that gives 10 pesos per share over 0.05%. So which do you think will give the higher value or the higher intrinsic value? So if you compute this, it will result into 100, and on the right side, it will result into 200. Okay, so therefore, based on the formula, so we can say that those firms that are paying high dividends would result into higher valuation of stock. So next is our some of the reasons why investors might prefer capital gains or capital appreciation. So one of the reasons perhaps is they want to avoid the transaction costs. So they just buy and hold. So remember that every week, every time they buy or sell, so meron yan siyang brokerage cost or transaction cost. And every time we receive dividends, we are also paying tax. So they don't want that. That's why some investors just wait and refer to capital gains. So next is the maximum tax rate is the same as on dividends. So as this base on the US taxation, that the dividends and the capital gains tax rate is the same. But remember that taxes on dividends are due in the year they are received. So when you receive your dividends now, is already subjected to the tax, while the taxes on capital gains, although mataas yung value ng stock mo, but you will only pay in the capital gains tax when the stock is sold. Pero meron ka pa ring babayaran tax sa capital gains. So aside from that, if an investor holds a stock until his or her death, beneficiaries can use the date of the death as the cost basis and escape all previously accrued capital gains. So, for example, during the lifetime of the deceased, okay, so before siya namatay, nakapagbigay pa siya ng 200 sa share, which is, yung share niya is 200 and then the cost is 10 pesos. So, the capital gains would be 190 per share. So, multiply that to the number of share, then multiply by the capital tax gain. So, yan na yung kanyang capital gains tax. But at the same time, yung time of death, yun yung babasihan para makompute ang estate tax. So, all asset before they are transferred to the ownership of their beneficiaries, they must pay estate tax, so which currently 6%, but the valuations of those stocks would be at the date of death 90 per share, so the cost would be 10. So the capital gain binabasihan to compute would be lesser compared to the other days na tataasan ang kanilang capital gains. So, ito na nga yung sinasabi na the beneficiaries can escape all previously accrued capital gains because your basis is on the day na nakaabot siya sa pinakamataas na price but at the date of death. So next is what's the information content or the signaling hypothesis. So the investors knew that the managers for the management has the best information. Kumbaga alam naman nila na the management knows well or knows better as to the performance or the real performance of the company. So a lot of investors are observing the behavior of the management, so taking them a signal of the management view of the future. So for example, if the management will declare dividend, so ang investors ang titignan yan. The management probably knows nga dun din naka-base ang prospect ng isang company. Of course, if nag-declare ka ng dividends, ibig sabihin, you have a money in the coming good, which is ang kanyang forecast or future prospect. It would be view as investors now. The coming that they are hold or their shares holding is going well, and the managers hate to cut dividends because that's embarrassing to their part. So the managers, they cannot issue dividends unless they think that they increase the dividends. Those increase must be backed up with sustainability, so they can see the future as very sustainable. So next is what's the clientele effect. Different group of investors or clienteles prefer different dividend policies. Firm's past dividend policy determines its current clientele of investors. Clientele effects impede changing dividend policy. Taxes and brokerage costs hurt investors who have to switch companies. So, depende daw sa composition sa iyong investors will have an influence on your dividend policy. So, for example, if most of your investors are retirees like pensioners and they want a stable or regular income, these investors would likely influence the management of dividends rather than waiting for capital gains or capital appreciations. So if your group of investors are mostly composed of mga probably young people, okay, so if these groups of people will have years to accumulate more capital gains, which they will meet their financial goals, most likely young investors would influence, so they prefer more the capital gains rather than having a stable or regular dividends. Next is the residual dividend model. So find the retained earnings needed for the capital budget. So among all the sources of financing, mas makakamura tayo sa retained earnings. Okay, so out from our net income, that's because we do not pay interest expense and we do not pay flotation cost or insurance cost of new stocks, 'di ba? Kung mag-i-issue tayo ng stocks, we pay a lot of charges. So that's why it's residual dividends. It's because the leftover earnings after deducting the capital budget. So with the residual dividend model, we can minimize the flotation cost, equity signaling, so it can minimize the weighted average cost. So, diba merong signal kapag mag-i-issue tayo ng tax. So, it minimize that signal. So that's why the management, before they finance outside or externally, they have to get their their financing first from the retained earnings. Pag hindi nila ma-target ang retained earning, then that's the time to consider sourcing the financing from external. Kumbaga, ang residual dividend model ay ginagamit ng company para mas ma-determine yung dividends na babayaran sa mga shareholders. So this is the formula of getting the residual dividend. So net income minus the target equity ratio times the total capital budget. So remember that the optimal capital structure, kung meron kang target structure, so dapat maintain mo yan. If there are no changes of course, with the cost of capital, so we have to maintain the optimal capital structure so that our weighted average cost of capital would always be at the minimum. So that's why if meron kang capital structure, we have to follow it consistently. So for example, so the optimal capital structure or target capital structure is 40 and 60%. So 40% will come from debt financing, and the rest is 60% will be from equity financing. Okay, so the forecasted net income is $600,000. So the question is, how much of the forecasted net income should be paid out as dividends? So this is the formula. Net income minus the target equity ratio, which is 60%, times the total capital budget. So your total capital budget is 800,000. So 60% lang ang finance ni equity. It's because the retained earnings part the equity. So 60% times 800,000, so you have 480,000. So 800,000 minus to the 480, which is the maximum amount that we can give as dividends. So to continue the calculate, so 60% of 800,000 is 480,000, and then calculate the excess or residual. So net forecasted net income of 600,000 minus to 480,000 budget for the capital. So you have a residual amount of 120,000, or it's the maximum amount that you can pay as dividends. So you can pick up dividends at the same time you're maintaining the weighted average cost of capital, and you are minimizing a flotation cost. Now, what if by the payout ratio for this? So we have 120,000 over 600,000, yung net income. So the dividend payout ratio is 20%. Okay, so the other set of payout ratio is what we term as plowback ratio, or it is the amount of net income that is given back or reinvest in the business if you have the plowback and ratio payout. So the plowback ratio is the residual or 100% minus the payout ratio, or perhaps to get the payout ratio, simply deduct 100% sa kanyang plowback ratio. So kung nagbigay siya ng dividend 20%, then the remainder is what we call the plowback ratio. Okay, so this is the percentage that you reinvest sa business. So out of your net income, 80% yan yung ibabalik sa business to be reinvested. So now, what's a dividend reinvestment plan or DRIP? So some investors will prefer capital gains over dividends. So that's why kahit naka-receive ng dividends, they will use those dividends to buy another shares. So this is the DRIP enable sa shareholders to automatically reinvest their dividends. To buy additional common shares. So they get more stocks than cash. Kumbaga, yung cash hindi nila nahahawakan because it is automatically reinvested to buy additional shares. So there are two types of plans for the DRIP. So you can use the open market or perhaps issue a new stock. So open market means nag-i-exist na in the secondary market or in the existing shares. While the new stock naman, you have to really issue additional shares. So, open market, the company does not receive any cash from it, from the open market. But kung mag-i-issue sila a new stock, then they will have a new cash or new proceeds. So that's you use the open market and new stock. So that's all. Thank you.